The rain hammered against the windows of the small diner on Highway 87, creating rivers of water that distorted the neon lights outside. Inside, the warmth fought against the October chill as truckers, travelers, and locals sought refuge from the storm. The smell of coffee and fried food filled the air, mixing with the sound of quiet conversations and clinking dishes. In the corner booth sat an elderly man, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of black coffee. His clothes told a story of hard times: faded jeans with patches at the knees, worn work boots that had seen countless miles, and a jacket that had clearly lived through many seasons. The jacket, once probably navy blue, now showed its age in frayed edges, missing buttons and fabric that had thinned from years of wear. Despite its condition, the man wore it with a quiet dignity that spoke of someone who had learned to make do with what he had. The man's name was Robert Chen, though nobody in the diner knew that. To them, he was just another traveler passing through their small Texas town. His face bore the lines of someone who had seen 7 decades of life, with silver hair that he kept neatly combed despite his modest appearance. His eyes, a deep brown, held a depth that suggested stories untold and experiences that had shaped him in ways that weren't immediately visible. Robert had been driving for 3 days straight, making his way from California to Florida, where his daughter lived. His old pickup truck, much like his jacket, had seen better days but still ran faithfully. He had stopped at this diner not just because of the storm, but because his limited budget meant he needed to stretch every dollar. The coffee was cheap, and if he nursed it long enough, he could wait out the worst of the weather without spending money on a motel room he couldn't afford. As he sat there, Robert's mind wandered to the events that had brought him to this point in his life. 3 months ago, he had been living in a small apartment in Los Angeles, getting by on a modest pension and the occasional odd job. Then came the diagnosis. His landlord had decided to sell the building, and Robert found himself among dozens of tenants forced to find new homes in a city where rent prices had skyrocketed beyond the reach of people like him. The decision to drive to Florida hadn't been easy. His daughter Sarah had been asking him to move closer for years, but Robert had always been independent, reluctant to burden his family. Now at 72, pride seemed like a luxury he could no longer afford. Sarah had found him a small apartment near her home and promised to help him settle in. It wasn't charity, she had insisted. It was family looking out for family. The diner door chimed as new customers entered, shaking off the rain and looking for empty tables. Robert glanced up briefly, noting the mix of people: a young couple with a fussy baby, an older woman traveling alone, and a man in an expensive suit who looked decidedly out of place in the humble establishment. The suited man surveyed the diner with barely concealed disdain, his eyes taking in the mismatched furniture, the worn linoleum floor, and the simple menu board hanging behind the counter. Robert returned his attention to his coffee, not particularly interested in the drama of other people's lives. He had learned long ago that everyone was fighting their own battles, and it wasn't his place to judge or interfere. But as he sat there, he became aware of a conversation happening at the counter, where the suited man had taken a seat despite several empty booths being available. The man was speaking loudly into his phone, apparently unconcerned about who might overhear him. His voice carried the tone of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. He was complaining about his car breaking down, about having to wait in this backwater dump for a tow truck, and about the quality of people he was forced to share space with. Robert tried to ignore the man's increasingly obnoxious behavior, but it became difficult when the stranger began making pointed comments about other customers. He criticized the young mother for not controlling her crying baby, made snide remarks about the waitress's appearance, and generally displayed the kind of entitled attitude that Robert had encountered too many times in his life. The breaking point came when the suited man's attention turned to Robert himself. The stranger had been watching him for several minutes, taking in the old man's humble appearance with obvious judgment. Finally, unable to contain himself, the man spoke loud enough for half the diner to hear. "Look at that," he said to no one in particular, but clearly intending for Robert to hear. "Some people have no shame. Coming into a decent establishment dressed like a homeless person. That jacket looks like it came from a garbage bin." The diner fell quiet. Even the baby stopped crying, as if sensing the tension in the air. Robert felt every eye in the place turn toward him, but he didn't look up from his coffee. He had faced worse humiliation in his life, and he had learned that responding to bullies often only made situations worse. But the suited man wasn't finished. Emboldened by Robert's silence, he continued his verbal assault. "It's just a tattered jacket," he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "But I suppose when you're at the bottom of society, you take what you can get. People like that are what's wrong with this country. No pride. No standards, just expecting handouts and sympathy." The waitress, a middle-aged woman named Betty, who had worked at the diner for 15 years, started to move toward the counter with the clear intention of asking the suited man to keep his opinions to himself. But Robert raised his hand slightly, a gentle gesture that somehow conveyed both authority and restraint. "It's all right," Robert said quietly, his voice carrying despite its soft tone. "The gentleman is entitled to his opinion." There was something in the way Robert spoke, a quality that made people listen despite the humble volume of his words. The suited man, however, seemed to interpret Robert's measured response as weakness rather than strength. "At least you know your place," the man continued, his confidence growing. "Though I have to wonder what kind of life choices lead a person to end up sitting alone in a roadside diner, wearing clothes that should have been thrown away years ago." Robert finally looked up, meeting the man's eyes across the diner. For just a moment, something flickered in Robert's gaze. Not anger, but a kind of quiet assessment, as if he were measuring the character of the person in front of him and finding it sadly lacking. The storm outside seemed to intensify, and the lights in the diner flickered briefly. In that moment of uncertainty, with rain battering the windows and tension crackling in the air like electricity, none of the people present could have imagined how dramatically the evening was about to change, or how completely their assumptions about the quiet man in the tattered jacket would be shattered. The suited man's phone rang, interrupting his tirade against Robert. He answered with the same pompous tone he had been using all evening, speaking loudly about business deals and important meetings. As he talked, he gestured dramatically, clearly enjoying being the center of attention in the small diner. Robert remained calm, sipping his coffee and watching the rain through the window. He had encountered men like this before, people who measured their worth by putting others down, who confused wealth with character, and who had never learned the difference between having authority and earning respect. Betty, the waitress, couldn't contain herself any longer. She had been serving people in this diner for 15 years and had developed a keen sense of character. Something about the quiet man in the corner told her there was more to him than met the eye, while everything about the loud businessman suggested he was exactly what he appeared to be, a bully who had never been properly challenged. "Mister," Betty said, approaching the suited man's table with a fresh pot of coffee, "maybe you could keep your voice down a little. We've got other customers trying to enjoy their meals." The man looked at her with undisguised irritation. "I'm conducting important business here, and frankly, I'm paying for my meal just like everyone else, which gives me the right to express my observations about the clientele." "Your observations aren't welcome when they're meant to hurt other people," Betty replied, her Texas accent becoming more pronounced as her anger grew. "That gentleman over there has been nothing but polite since he walked in. He's not bothering anyone, and he doesn't deserve your nasty comments." The suited man laughed, a harsh sound that carried no real humor. "Oh, I see. You're defending your fellow bottom feeders. How touching. But let me explain something to you, sweetheart. I'm a successful businessman. I drive a car worth more than this entire establishment. I wear suits that cost more than most people make in a month. And I don't need lectures about manners from someone who pours coffee for a living." Robert set down his cup with a soft clink that somehow commanded attention. When he spoke, his voice was still quiet, but it carried a weight that made everyone in the diner listen. "Success," Robert said, "is an interesting word. It means different things to different people." The businessman turned toward Robert with a smirk. "Oh, the vagrant wants to share his philosophy? Please enlighten us with your wisdom about success. I'm sure your vast experience sleeping in truck stops has given you deep insights into what it means to achieve something in life." Robert studied the man for a long moment before responding. "I've learned that a person's character isn't measured by what they own, but by how they treat others when they think no one important is watching." "Character?" The suited man's voice rose. "Character doesn't pay bills. Character doesn't buy houses or cars or anything else that matters in the real world. You want to know what matters? Results. achievement, making something of yourself instead of settling for mediocrity. Several other customers had stopped eating to watch the exchange. The young couple with the baby looked uncomfortable, clearly wishing they were somewhere else. The older woman traveling alone seemed fascinated, as if she were watching a play unfold. Even the cook had emerged from the kitchen to see what was happening. Robert reached into his jacket pocket, and for a moment, the businessman tensed as if expecting some kind of confrontation. But Robert only pulled out a worn leather wallet, the kind that had clearly been carried for many years. From it, he withdrew a $10 bill and placed it on the table next to his coffee cup. "Betty," Robert said, "thank you for the coffee and the kindness. The service here is excellent." As Robert stood to leave, the businessman couldn't resist one final insult. "That's right, runaway, typical. People like you always back down when confronted with the truth. You'll probably sleep in your truck tonight, dreaming about what it would be like to actually amount to something." Robert paused at the door, his hand on the handle. Outside, the storm was beginning to weaken, but the rain still fell steadily. He turned back to face the diner, and something in his posture had changed. There was a straightness to his spine, a set to his shoulders that hadn't been there before. "You know," Robert said, his voice still calm but carrying a new authority, "I did sleep in my truck last night, and the night before, not because I had to, but because I chose to, because I wanted to see this country one more time, to remember what it looks like when you're driving through it instead of flying over it." The businessman started to interrupt, but Robert continued, and something in his tone made the other man fall silent. "I've been thinking about success lately," Robert went on, "about what it really means. I've known successful people who had nothing, and I've known failures who had everything. The difference was never about money or possessions. It was about whether they made the world a little better or a little worse by being in it. What would you know about making the world better?" the suited man challenged, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Robert smiled then, an expression that was both sad and knowing. "More than you might think." He reached into his jacket again, but this time he pulled out something that made several people in the diner gasp. It was a military cap, pristine despite its obvious age, with 4 silver stars gleaming on the front. The fabric was immaculate, the visor perfectly shaped, and it clearly belonged to someone of the highest military rank. The diner fell completely silent. Even the sounds from the kitchen stopped as the cook stared in amazement. The 4 stars could only mean one thing. This humble man in the tattered jacket was a 4-star general, one of the highest-ranking officers in the United States military. Robert held the cap for a moment, running his fingers along the brim with obvious reverence. Then he placed it carefully on his head, and the transformation was remarkable. Suddenly, the shabby clothes seemed irrelevant. The man standing in the doorway carried himself with unmistakable authority, the bearing of someone who had commanded thousands of soldiers and made decisions that affected the course of history. The businessman's face had gone pale. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound emerged. Around the diner, people were pulling out their phones, some taking pictures, others apparently looking something up online. "General Chen," the older woman traveling alone whispered, recognition dawning in her voice. "You're General Robert Chen." Robert nodded slightly. "I was. I retired 3 years ago." Betty dropped her coffee pot, the ceramic shattering on the floor, but nobody moved to clean it up. Everyone was staring at the man they had dismissed as just another down-on-his-luck traveler. The young mother was frantically typing on her phone, then looked up with amazement. "You're the hero of Operation Desert Storm. You saved thousands of lives. You won the Medal of Honor." "I served my country," Robert said simply, "just like millions of other men and women have done." The businessman finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. I didn't know. I'm sorry, Robert raised his hand, the same gentle gesture he had used earlier to calm Betty. "You didn't know because you didn't ask. You saw what you wanted to see and made assumptions based on appearances. That's a dangerous habit, especially for someone who claims to be successful in business." The implications of what had just happened were sinking in around the diner. This wasn't just any retired military officer. This was one of the most decorated generals in recent American history, a man whose strategic brilliance had saved countless lives and whose name appeared in history books. The silence in the diner stretched on as everyone processed what they had just witnessed. The businessman, whose name was Marcus Whitfield, sat frozen in his chair, his face cycling through various shades of red and white as the full weight of his behavior hit him. He had just spent the better part of an hour insulting and humiliating a four-star general, a genuine American hero whose service record was legendary. Betty was the first to move, rushing to get a broom to clean up the broken coffee pot, but her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold it. The cook, a Vietnam veteran named Pete, emerged fully from the kitchen with tears in his eyes. He had recognized the name immediately when the older woman had spoken it. "General Chen," Pete said, his voice choked with emotion. "I served under Colonel Morrison in the 173rd Airborne in Vietnam." Morrison always talked about the young lieutenant who saved his unit in '68. "That was you, wasn't it?" Robert's expression softened. "Tommy Morrison was a good man and a fine officer. He saved more lives than I ever did." "How is he?" "He passed 5 years ago, sir, cancer. But he never stopped talking about you. Said you were the bravest man he ever knew." The young mother had been reading from her phone, her voice growing more amazed with each sentence. "It says here that you served 3 tours in Vietnam, received the Medal of Honor for single-handedly rescuing 12 wounded soldiers under heavy fire, later served in the Gulf War where your tactical innovations saved thousands of coalition lives, and then commanded forces in Afghanistan." "The internet tends to exaggerate," Robert said gently. "I was just a soldier doing my job." "Just a soldier?" The older woman, who had introduced herself as Margaret, stood up from her table. "General, my son served under you in Afghanistan." "Captain David Morrison?" "Yes, related to the Colonel Pete mentioned." "David always said you were the kind of leader who put your soldiers' lives ahead of your own career. He said you visited every wounded soldier in the hospital, regardless of rank." Robert's composure cracked slightly at this. "David was a fine officer." "How is he?" Margaret's smile was radiant. "He's a doctor now, pediatric surgery. He says you inspired him to dedicate his life to saving others. He named his son Robert after you." Meanwhile, Marcus Whitfield was experiencing what could only be described as a complete psychological meltdown. He had built his entire identity around the belief that wealth and status made him superior to others. The idea that he had just humiliated someone whose actual accomplishments dwarfed anything he had ever achieved was shattering his worldview in real time. "I don't understand," Marcus said, his voice barely audible. If you're who they say you are, why are you dressed like? Why are you driving an old truck? Why are you staying in diners instead of 5-star hotels?" Robert removed his cap and held it carefully in his hands. "Because this is how I choose to live. My pension is comfortable, but I've never needed much. I prefer simple pleasures. A good cup of coffee, honest conversation, the open road. Material possessions were never what motivated me." "But you could have anything," Marcus insisted, as if Robert's lifestyle choices were somehow personally offensive to him. "You could live in a mansion, drive expensive cars, wear designer clothes. You've earned the right to luxury." "I earned the right to choose how I want to live," Robert corrected. "And I choose to live simply." "The jacket you mocked. It belonged to my father. He wore it while working 3 jobs to put me through college. It's worth more to me than any expensive clothing could ever be." Betty had finally managed to clean up the broken coffee pot and now approached Robert's table with a fresh cup of coffee. "General, sir, your coffee is on the house forever. Anytime you're in town, you eat and drink for free." "That's very kind, Betty, but unnecessary. I pay my own way." "With respect, sir," Pete called from the kitchen. "This is our way of saying thank you, not just for your service, but for showing us what real class looks like." The comment hit Marcus like a physical blow. He had spent the entire evening bragging about his wealth and success, looking down on others and demonstrating exactly what real class was not. In contrast, Robert had endured insults with dignity, spoken kindly to everyone, and revealed his extraordinary background only when necessary to make a point about character. "General Chen," Marcus said, standing up from his table on unsteady legs, "I owe you an apology, a profound apology. My behavior tonight was inexcusable." Robert studied him for a moment. "We all make mistakes, Mr. Whitfield." "Marcus Whitfield. I run a consulting firm in Dallas." "Well, Mr. Whitfield, the measure of a person isn't whether they make mistakes, but what they do after they realize they've made them." Marcus felt tears welling up in his eyes, something that hadn't happened since childhood. I don't know what to do. I've spent my whole life believing that success meant having more than other people, looking down on anyone who had less. Tonight I realized I've been the poorest person in every room I've ever entered. The transformation in Marcus was visible to everyone in the diner. The arrogance had drained out of him, replaced by genuine shame and something that might have been the beginning of wisdom. "General," Margaret said, "would you mind if I called my son? He's on the West Coast, but I know he'd want to speak with you." "Of course," Robert replied, "though I hope he won't feel obligated. I was just doing my job." As Margaret dialed her phone, the young mother approached with her baby. "General Chen, I know this might sound strange, but could you hold my daughter for a moment? I want to take a picture. Someday when she's older, I want to be able to tell her she was held by a real hero." Robert's eyes moistened as he took the baby, who immediately stopped fussing and seemed content in his arms. "She's beautiful. What's her name?" "Hope. We named her Hope." "That's perfect," Robert said softly, gently rocking the baby. "Hope is what keeps us going even in the darkest times." Marcus watched this scene unfold, seeing how naturally Robert connected with people, how his presence seemed to bring out the best in everyone around him. It was a leadership quality that couldn't be taught or bought. It came from genuine care for others. "General," Marcus said, his voice stronger now, "I need to ask you something. How do you do it? How do you stay humble despite everything you've accomplished? How do you treat people with such kindness when the world has given you every reason to believe you're superior?" Robert handed the baby back to her mother and considered the question carefully. "Because the world taught me the opposite lesson, Mr. Whitfield. Every position of authority I ever held was a responsibility, not a privilege. Every person under my command was someone's son or daughter, someone who mattered more than any mission or objective. The higher you rise, the more you realize how much you depend on others. I've had it backward my entire life," Marcus admitted. "I thought success meant being above other people, not being responsible for them." "It's not too late to learn," Robert said. "The best leaders are often those who've made the most mistakes because they understand the cost of getting things wrong." Pete emerged from the kitchen carrying a plate of food. "General, I made you a sandwich. It's not much, but it's made with gratitude." "Thank you, Pete. That's very thoughtful." As Robert ate, more customers began arriving despite the late hour. Word was apparently spreading through the small town that a famous general was at the local diner. But Robert treated each new person with the same courtesy he had shown everyone else, neither seeking attention nor avoiding it, simply being present and authentic with whoever wanted to meet him. Marcus remained at his table, watching and learning. He saw how Robert remembered everyone's name after hearing it just once, how he asked genuine questions about their lives, how he made each person feel important and valued. It was a masterclass in human dignity, and Marcus was taking mental notes on every interaction. As the evening wore on, the small diner transformed into something resembling a community gathering. More locals had arrived after hearing about General Chen's presence, but the atmosphere remained respectful and warm rather than circus-like. People shared stories, asked thoughtful questions, and seemed genuinely interested in connecting with this humble hero who had appeared in their midst. Margaret had successfully reached her son David on the West Coast. The phone conversation between Robert and the former captain lasted nearly 20 minutes, filled with laughter, shared memories, and updates about David's family and medical practice. When Robert finally handed the phone back to Margaret, both men were clearly moved by the reunion. "He says to tell you that the leadership principles you taught him have made him a better doctor and a better father," Margaret relayed, tears streaming down her cheeks. "He says you saved his life in more ways than one." Marcus watched these interactions with growing fascination and shame. He realized he had never had conversations like these, deep, meaningful exchanges where people genuinely cared about each other's well-being. His own relationships were mostly transactional, based on what people could do for him or what he could gain from them. A middle-aged man in work clothes entered the diner, shaking off the rain. He paused when he saw the crowd, then spotted Robert at the center of attention. His face lit up with recognition. "General Chen? Sir, is that really you?" Robert stood and extended his hand. "I am, and you are?" "Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, sir." "Well, former sergeant, I served under you in Afghanistan 2003 to 2005. You probably don't remember me, but..." Miguel Rodriguez from San Antonio, Robert interrupted with a smile. You were with the 82nd Airborne. You had a daughter born while you were deployed, and you were worried about missing too much of her childhood. Rodriguez's jaw dropped. You remember that? I remember all my soldiers, Miguel. How is Maria? She must be about 20 now. 22, sir. She just graduated from college, pre-med. She wants to be a military doctor, says she wants to serve like her father did. That's wonderful. You must be very proud. As Rodriguez joined the group, sharing stories of their time serving together, Marcus felt increasingly isolated by his own behavior. Here was a general who remembered individual soldiers from decades ago, who cared about their families and their futures. Meanwhile, Marcus couldn't even remember the names of his own employees half the time. Betty approached Marcus's table with a fresh cup of coffee. You've been sitting here for hours, honey. You okay? Marcus looked up at her, really seeing her for the first time that evening. Betty, can I ask you something? What's your last name? Henderson. Betty Henderson. How long have you worked here, Betty? 15 years come December. Do you have family? Betty seemed surprised by his interest. 2 grown kids. My daughter's a teacher in Austin and my son's in the military, stationed in Germany. What's your son's name? Private First Class James Henderson. He just enlisted last year. Marcus felt a stab of recognition. Throughout the evening, he had dismissed Betty as just a waitress. But she was a mother whose son was serving their country, a woman who had worked steadily for 15 years to support her family. Her contributions to society were real and meaningful, while his own accomplishments suddenly seemed shallow by comparison. Betty, Marcus said quietly, I owe you an apology too. I was rude and dismissive earlier. You were just trying to do your job and I made it harder for you. Betty's expression softened. That's all right, honey. We all have bad days. This wasn't a bad day, Marcus admitted. This was me showing my true character, and it wasn't pretty. Across the diner, Robert was sharing stories about his transition to civilian life. He spoke honestly about the challenges of retiring from military service, the difficulty of finding purpose after a lifetime of mission-driven work, and his decision to live simply and focus on relationships rather than accomplishments. The hardest part, Robert was saying, wasn't giving up the authority or the status. It was learning to measure success differently. In the military, success is often measured in clear objectives. Missions accomplished, lives saved, strategic goals achieved. In civilian life, success is more subtle. It's about the quality of your relationships, the positive impact you have on individuals, the legacy you leave in the hearts of people you've touched. Marcus found himself leaning forward, hanging on every word. This was exactly what he needed to hear, though he was only beginning to understand why. General, asked a young man who had arrived with his girlfriend, what advice would you give to someone who wants to be a leader? Robert considered the question carefully. First, understand that leadership is not about being in charge. It's about taking care of those in your charge. Second, lead by example in everything you do. People watch your actions more than they listen to your words. Third, never ask someone to do something you wouldn't do yourself. And finally, remember that your success as a leader is measured by the success of your team, not your individual achievements. These principles hit Marcus like revelations. He thought about his own leadership style, demanding, authoritarian, focused primarily on his own advancement. He realized he had never truly led anyone. He had simply used his position to get what he wanted. A local police officer entered the diner, apparently having heard about the gathering. But instead of creating any disruption, he simply approached Robert with quiet respect. General Chen, I'm Officer Williams. I just wanted to thank you for your service and to let you know that you're welcome in our town anytime. Thank you, Officer Williams. This is a wonderful community. You should be proud to serve here. The police officer beamed at the compliment. Sir, if you don't mind me asking, what brings you through our little town? I'm driving to Florida to be closer to my daughter. Taking the scenic route and enjoying the journey. Well, sir, if you need anything during your stay, directions, recommendations, anything at all, please don't hesitate to call the station. Marcus watched this exchange with growing admiration. Robert had the ability to make everyone feel valued and important, from the waitress to the police officer to the former soldiers. It wasn't an act or a technique. It was genuine respect for other human beings. As the night grew later, people began to leave, but each one made a point of thanking Robert personally. He gave each person his full attention, making them feel as if their gratitude mattered deeply to him. Finally, it was just Robert, Marcus, Betty, and Pete left in the diner. The storm had completely passed, leaving the night clear and calm. Marcus knew his tow truck would be arriving soon, and his rental car would be ready in the morning, but he found himself reluctant to leave. "General," Marcus said, approaching Robert's table, "could I sit with you for a moment?" "Of course." Marcus sat down across from the man he had spent the evening insulting. "I need to tell you something. I've been successful in business, by most people's standards anyway. I've made a lot of money, built a profitable company, achieved most of my professional goals. But tonight I realized I've been living my life completely wrong." Robert listened without judgment as Marcus continued. "I've spent years looking down on people, thinking that my success made me better than others. I've been cruel to employees, dismissive of service workers, and generally acted like my money gave me the right to treat people poorly. Tonight you showed me what real success looks like." "And what does it look like?" Robert asked gently. "It looks like remembering the names of soldiers you served with 20 years ago. It looks like treating a waitress with the same respect you'd show a CEO. It looks like wearing your father's old jacket because it means something to you, regardless of what other people think." Marcus paused, struggling with emotions he hadn't felt in years. "I want to change," he said finally. "I want to be the kind of person who makes others feel valued instead of small. But I don't know how. I've been the other way for so long, I'm not sure I know how to be different." Robert studied Marcus for a long moment, seeing something in the businessman's eyes that hadn't been there earlier: genuine humility and a sincere desire to grow. "The fact that you want to change is the first step," Robert said. "And the most important one. Change is possible, Mr. Whitfield, but it requires daily conscious effort. You have to choose to be better every single day in every interaction." "Where do I start?" Robert smiled. "You start by treating the next person you meet with kindness and respect, regardless of their position in life. Then you do it again with the person after that and the person after that. Eventually it becomes who you are instead of something you have to remember to do." The tow truck arrived just after midnight, its headlights cutting through the darkness as it pulled into the diner's parking lot. Marcus felt a pang of regret. He wasn't ready for this transformative evening to end. The conversations with General Chen had opened his eyes to possibilities he had never considered, ways of living and thinking that seemed infinitely more meaningful than his previous pursuits. "That must be for me," Marcus said, glancing toward the window. "Mr. Whitfield," Robert said, "before you go, may I give you something?" Marcus nodded, curious about what the general might offer. Robert reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn notebook. It was clearly old, with a cracked leather cover and pages yellowed with age. He opened it carefully and tore out a single page, which he handed to Marcus. "This belonged to my father," Robert explained. "He kept a journal of life lessons, things he learned from his mistakes, wisdom he wanted to pass on. This particular page has been my guide for over 50 years. Marcus looked down at the handwritten page. The writing was in faded ink, but still legible. At the top it read, "Rules for living well." And below that were 10 simple principles. Treat every person as if they matter, because they do. Listen more than you speak. Judge actions, not appearances. Admit when you're wrong and learn from it. Help others without expecting anything in return. Remember that wealth is measured by what you give, not what you have. Be the same person in public and private. Choose kindness over being right. Leave every place better than you found it. Never forget where you came from." Marcus read through the list twice, feeling each principle resonate with the lessons he had learned that evening. These weren't complex business strategies or sophisticated philosophies. They were simple truths that somehow felt revolutionary to him. "General, I can't take this," Marcus said, though his hands trembled as he held the precious page. "This belonged to your father, and now it belongs to you," Robert replied firmly. "My father would be pleased to know his words might help someone find a better path. Besides, I have the rest of the journal, and more importantly, I have these principles memorized. They've guided every important decision I've made." The tow truck driver entered the diner, looking around for his customer. Marcus raised his hand reluctantly. "That's me," he called out, then turned back to Robert. "General, how do I know if I'm really changing? How do I know I won't just go back to my old ways when I get home? Robert considered this question carefully. Change is not a destination, Mr. Whitfield. It's a daily choice. You'll know you're changing when you start measuring your success by how many people you lift up, instead of how many you leave behind. Betty approached with the coffee pot one final time. Gentlemen, last call for coffee? Thank you, Betty, Robert said. You've taken excellent care of us tonight. Marcus looked at Betty with new eyes. Betty, before I go, I want you to know something. You're an excellent waitress, but more than that, you're a kind person. Your son is lucky to have you as a mother, and this community is lucky to have you. Betty's face lit up with surprise and pleasure. Why, thank you, Mr. Whitfield. That's very sweet of you to say. After Marcus left with the tow truck driver, exchanging contact information with Robert and promising to stay in touch, the diner fell quiet. Pete had finished cleaning the kitchen and was preparing to close up for the night. General, Betty said as she wiped down tables, I've been thinking about what happened tonight. That man, Mr. Whitfield, he seemed like a completely different person by the time he left. People can change, Robert replied. Sometimes they just need to see a different way of being in the world. You have a gift for bringing out the best in people, Pete observed, emerging from the kitchen with his coat. I saw it with the soldiers who came in tonight, the way they talked about serving under you. And I saw it with that businessman. You didn't lecture him or put him down, you just showed him something better. Robert smiled. Everyone has good inside them, Pete. Sometimes it just gets buried under fear or hurt or misunderstanding. When you treat people with dignity, it reminds them of their own worth. As the three of them prepared to leave the diner, Betty turned to Robert with a thoughtful expression. General, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Why do you live so simply? I mean, you've accomplished so much you could have anything you wanted. Why choose to drive across the country in an old truck, staying in places like this? Robert looked around the diner, at the mismatched furniture, the worn linoleum, the simple menu board. Then he looked at Betty and Pete, these good people who had welcomed him with such warmth. Because this is where real life happens, he said, not in boardrooms or fancy restaurants or expensive hotels. Real life happens in places like this with people like you. The conversations I had tonight, the connections I made. You can't buy experiences like that. They have to be earned through authenticity and genuine care for others. Betty wiped away a tear. You've given us something special tonight, General. A reminder of what really matters. You gave me something too, Robert replied. You reminded me why I served, why it was all worth it. To protect communities like this, people like you who make the world better simply by being in it. As they walked out into the clear night air, Robert looked up at the stars, brilliant now that the storm had passed. He thought about his journey, both the physical trip to Florida and the longer journey of his life. Tomorrow he would continue driving east, but tonight had reminded him that the destination was less important than the people you met along the way. Pete shook Robert's hand firmly. General, it's been an honor. If you're ever back this way, you've got friends here. Thank you, Pete. That means more to me than you know. Betty surprised Robert by giving him a gentle hug. You take care of yourself, General. And thank you for showing us what a real hero looks like. As Robert walked to his truck, he reflected on the evening's events. In a few hours, Marcus Whitfield had gone from being a bully to someone genuinely seeking to change his life. It was a reminder that people were capable of growth and transformation at any age, given the right inspiration and opportunity. Robert climbed into his truck and started the engine. As he pulled out of the parking lot, he could see Betty and Pete in his rearview mirror, still standing outside the diner, waving goodbye. He thought about his father's old jacket, hanging in his closet, and the principles on the page he had given to Marcus. The road ahead was dark, but Robert felt a sense of satisfaction. He had served his country for decades, leading soldiers and making strategic decisions that affected thousands of lives. But tonight, in a small diner on a Texas highway, he had touched individual lives in a personal way. He had reminded a proud businessman that true success was measured in human terms, and he had been reminded himself of the simple joys of connecting with good people. As he drove through the night toward his new life in Florida, Robert Chen carried with him the memory of an evening when a chance encounter had become something much more. A reminder that heroism wasn't just about battlefield courage or strategic brilliance. Sometimes it was about showing someone a better way to live, one conversation at a time. 6 months later, Marcus Whitfield stood in the lobby of his Dallas consulting firm, but everything about the place had changed. Gone were the intimidating marble surfaces and cold corporate atmosphere. The space now felt warm and welcoming, with comfortable seating areas where employees could gather informally, and walls decorated with photos celebrating team achievements and community service projects. Marcus himself looked different too. He still wore quality suits, but his demeanor had transformed completely. The arrogance and superiority that had once defined his presence had been replaced by genuine warmth and interest in others. He greeted every employee by name, remembered details about their families, and made a point of asking about their well-being rather than just their productivity. "Good morning, Sarah," Marcus said to the receptionist as he entered. "How did your daughter's piano recital go last night?" Sarah's face lit up with surprise and pleasure. Even after 6 months, she wasn't entirely used to this version of her boss. "It went wonderfully, Mr. Whitfield. Thank you for asking. She played Chopin's Minute Waltz almost perfectly." "That's fantastic. You must be so proud. Please give her my congratulations." As Marcus walked through the office, he stopped to check in with various team members, asking about their projects not from a position of oversight and criticism, but with genuine interest in their challenges and successes. The atmosphere in the office had become collaborative rather than competitive, supportive rather than fearful. The transformation hadn't been easy. Marcus had returned from that night in Texas determined to change, but old habits die hard. He had stumbled many times in those first few weeks, reverting to his old demanding and dismissive ways before catching himself. The page from General Chen's father had become his constant companion, folded carefully in his wallet, referred to multiple times each day. The real turning point had come when Marcus decided to be completely honest with his employees about what had happened that night and his commitment to change. He had called an all-hands meeting and told them the entire story, his shameful behavior toward General Chen, the revelation of who the general really was, and the life lessons he had learned from the experience. "I've been a terrible boss and a worse human being," he had admitted to his shocked staff. "I've created a workplace based on fear and hierarchy rather than respect and collaboration. I want to change that, but I can't do it alone. I need your help to become the kind of leader this company deserves." The response had been mixed at first. Some employees were skeptical, expecting this to be another corporate manipulation tactic. Others were cautiously optimistic. A few who had been considering leaving the company decided to stay and see what would happen. Marcus had backed up his words with actions. He implemented a profit-sharing program, giving employees a stake in the company's success. He established a fund to help team members facing financial emergencies. He created opportunities for professional development and promotion from within. Most importantly, he changed how he treated people on a daily basis. The results had been remarkable. Employee turnover, which had been high under Marcus's previous leadership style, dropped to nearly zero. Productivity increased as people felt valued and empowered. The company's reputation in the business community improved dramatically as word spread about the positive changes, but the most significant changes were in Marcus himself. He had discovered that treating people well wasn't just morally right. It was infinitely more satisfying than his previous approach. The genuine smiles from employees, the improved family dynamics at home, the sense of purpose that came from helping others succeed. These rewards far exceeded anything his old lifestyle had provided. On this particular morning, Marcus was preparing for a special event. General Robert Chen was coming to visit the office. The two men had stayed in touch over the past 6 months, exchanging emails and phone calls as Marcus navigated his personal transformation. When Marcus had invited the general to see what had become of the company, Robert had agreed to stop by during one of his visits to Dallas to see his granddaughter. At precisely 10 o'clock, Robert arrived at the office. He was dressed simply as always, but Marcus greeted him with the respect and warmth due to both a mentor and a friend. "General Chen, welcome to our office. I can't tell you how honored we are to have you here." Robert looked around the transformed space with obvious approval. "This is quite different from what I expected, Marcus. It feels like a place where people would actually want to work." "That was the idea," Marcus replied. "Would you like me to show you around and introduce you to the team?" As they toured the office, Robert was struck by the obvious change in atmosphere. Employees seemed relaxed and engaged, collaborating freely and approaching Marcus with questions and updates without any apparent fear or hesitation. It was clear that the transformation Marcus had described in their conversations was real and substantial. "General Chen," said Jennifer, one of the senior consultants, "Mr. Whitfield has told us so much about you. Thank you for your service to our country." "Thank you, Jennifer. Marcus tells me you've been instrumental in implementing the new client relations program." Jennifer beamed with pride. "It's been incredibly rewarding. We're focusing on building long-term partnerships rather than just completing transactions. Our client satisfaction scores have never been higher." This was exactly the kind of change Marcus had hoped to see. Under his old leadership model, employees had been focused primarily on billable hours and short-term profits. Now they were thinking strategically about client relationships and sustainable business practices. During lunch, Marcus and Robert sat in the company's new break room, a comfortable space with natural lighting and areas for both quiet reflection and group discussions. Marcus had been eager to show Robert this particular change. "Under my old system," Marcus explained, "we had a sterile corporate cafeteria where people ate quickly and got back to work. Now we have this space where people can actually relax, build relationships with their colleagues, and recharge during the day." "It makes a difference," Robert observed. "When people feel cared for, they care more about their work and each other." "That's exactly what we found. Our employee satisfaction surveys show dramatic improvements across every metric. But more importantly, I can see it in people's faces. They're happier, more creative, more collaborative." Robert studied his friend carefully. "And what about you, Marcus? How has this transformation affected your own life?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "General, I used to measure my days by how much money I made or how many people I could impress with my success. Now I measure them by how many people I helped feel valued and supported. It's a completely different way of living, and it's infinitely more fulfilling." "That's the real victory," Robert said. "Not just changing how you treat others, but discovering who you really are when you strip away all the pretense and competition." After lunch, Marcus gathered the entire staff in the main conference room. He wanted them to hear directly from General Chen about leadership, service, and the principles that had guided his remarkable life. Robert spoke to the group for about 30 minutes, sharing stories from his military career, but focusing primarily on the leadership lessons he had learned along the way. He talked about the responsibility that comes with authority, the importance of serving others rather than being served, and the satisfaction that comes from helping people achieve their potential. True leadership, Robert concluded, is not about commanding others to follow you. It's about inspiring them to become the best versions of themselves. When you help others succeed, you create a legacy that extends far beyond your own accomplishments. The questions and discussion that followed were engaging and thoughtful. Employees asked about everything from decision-making under pressure to maintaining integrity in challenging situations. Robert answered each question with the same thoughtfulness and wisdom that had impressed Marcus that night in the diner. As the day wound down, Marcus walked Robert to his car. The general's visit had been everything Marcus had hoped for and more. Validation that the changes he had made were real and meaningful, inspiration for the team, and a reminder of the principles that continued to guide his transformation. "General," Marcus said as they reached Robert's truck, "I can never thank you enough for what you did for me that night. You saved my life in a way that's just as real as if you had pulled me from a burning building." Robert smiled. "You saved your own life, Marcus. I just reminded you that there was something worth saving. The hard work of change, that was all you. Still, I want you to know that your father's principles have become my daily guide. I carry that page with me everywhere, and I read it every morning before I start my day." "He would be proud to know his words are still helping people," Robert said, "and I'm proud to see what you've done with them." As Robert drove away, Marcus stood in the parking lot for a few minutes, reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this point. 6 months ago, he had been a successful but miserable man, isolated by his own arrogance and cruelty. Today, he was surrounded by people who respected and genuinely liked him, leading a company that made a positive difference in people's lives.